Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to begin our third day looking at Unit 1.1, East Asia, and we're going to focus in on cultural diffusion. All right. Our learning objective, explain the effects of cultural diffusion from China to its peripheral states over time. It's peripheral states over time. All right, so let's begin with our daily 5. All right, so which area was only affected by the spread of Buddhism in the period from 200 BC to 1450? So take a moment and look at it. Hopefully you got the correct answer as 3. All right. Next one way in which the code of chivalry in Europe and the code of Bushido in Japan were similar is that both codes were intended to. So take a moment and read through those. All right. And hopefully you got the correct answer as 2, guide of behavior. So Bushido was in your homework last night. All right, next one. Carefully drawn calligraphy, Zen gardens, and the tea ceremony are examples of. I'll go ahead and take a moment, pause, and read through these. All right, and hopefully the answer you got was 3, early Japanese culture. These are also really good examples of Chinese cultural diffusion in Japan as well, since Japan's writing system was diffused from China. Zen gardens is interconnected with Zen Buddhism, which was diffused from China, right? And of course, tea. And it becomes known as the tea ceremony. Tea itself comes from China. All right. All right, so go ahead and pause and read this. All right, so according to the map, which conclusion about China during the Tang and Song dynasty is accurate? Hopefully the answer you got was 2. All right. Oh no, it was 4. China's over. Definitely not 2. 4. China traded extensively with other nations and regions, right? So you're seeing here, and in class when we hit this, what you are seeing here with this is a good example of what we're talking about in class today. So, which is China, right? China equals, you can put that so you see it. China equals a regional hegemon. All right. China is a regional hegemon. So you've got kind of China here, all right, and kind of Asia goes down. So China is here. We're looking for, when you're talking about hegemony, right? You're talking about hegemony. And I do have a slide that kind of looks at this concept, right? What is hegemony? So let's kind of think about what this word means, right? So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the Pantheon in Rome, right? So what is hegemony, and who is the global hegemonic power today, right? So when we're talking about hegemony, we're talking about all kinds of things. So I guess let me kind of toggle back and forth here. You could be talking about what we just saw a second ago, culture. All right. So whose culture are you seeing in the city of Rome here, as you kind of look out at the Pantheon? So food is culture, right? So where does that derive from? Or if you don't like looking at McDonald's as food, McDonald's is a multinational corporation, right? So this is American free market capitalist economics being diffused around the world and practiced around the world, right? So where is this hegemonic influence coming from? Where is this right? Where is this influence coming from? So when we talk about this situation in which one nation state plays a predominant role organizing, regulating, stabilizing the political economy of its neighbor, right? So who is the center in which economic, political, cultural, right? Things are flowing. All right. So originally, this is used to describe the relationship between the city-states in classical Greece. So much of the golden age of ancient Greece, the kind of late 400s down until the around 430 or so, is kind of dominated by Athenian hegemony, and then we see the Sparta conquer, right? So we have a couple of decades of Spartan hegemony, and then the Macedonian hegemony will begin for a fair bit. All right, so let me just kind of come back here and just, right? So kind of culture, who is the global hegemon today? A very clear and easy argument could be made that from 1945 until, let's say the early 2000s, that the United States was the global hegemon. But since about, let's just say, since the early 2000s, so as not to put a year on it, we have been seeing a decline in American hegemony. And this manifests itself in a number of different ways. Let's just kind of talk about one. Right? We are seeing a global decline in democracy around the world, right? So the number of countries that are democratic, which is the emulation of the American political system, right, would be a good example of American political hegemony. The number of countries on planet Earth that are democracies is on decline, and we are seeing a rise in countries that are adopting more autocratic practices, right? So which hegemon are countries around the world? Which rising hegemon are countries around the world trying to emulate? Right. So these are discussions that we'll have kind of later on in the course. Right. Other examples. Right. So social, like for example, Confucian, filial piety. Right. So would be kind of a good example of that. Also technology. Right. Technology. And of course, we're going to see, human environmental interaction, right? So these are all just our course themes, okay? These are all just our course themes. And so where are these things being diffused out to? Let's just kind of just draw Korea, right? Let's draw Korea there. Let's draw, and I apologize for, I'm just going to draw just kind of a big archipelago here for Japan, right, with no real attempt to try to be accurate. Let's just put Vietnam down here. So, right. So what we're really looking at today is, who is the regional hegemon? The regional hegemon is China, right? And the question we need to concern ourselves with is what type of cultural diffusion, right? What type of cultural diffusion do we see between China and Japan, China and Korea, China and Vietnam, right? So that's what we'll be concerning ourselves with for today's activity. All right. So let's just kind of finish up these questions though, and then we'll get going. A similarity between Shinto in Japan and animism in African societies is that both. Take a moment and read those. Right, so hopefully your homework helped you with that one. So number 3, right? Belief in spirits exist in nature. Here's a question about the Grand Canal. What conclusion about the Grand Canal system in China can be drawn from the information shown on the map? So take a moment and look. And hopefully you got the answer to be 3. All right. And I think this might be the last question. Based on the information in this chart, what is a valid conclusion about Chinese society during the Tang and the Song dynasties? So take a few few minutes and think about these options. All right, so hopefully, hopefully you got the answer to be 3. Some people living in China had opportunities for social mobility. And of course, in class, we just kind of discussed really quickly what are 2 ways in which, social mobility existed in China, right? So it's pretty quick to just figure it out from watching this. You'll have merchants who have excess resources from their occupation, and they'll be able to purchase land and become part of that landed gentry class, or this landed aristocracy class. And of course, merchants and peasants could also join that gentry class through civil service exams, right? Application of Confucian practices, right? So, they would potentially become scholar officials. Maybe even the best of the best might even make it into the court, right? So we do see some level of social mobility in ancient China. And there's a Japan question too. Speaking of social mobility, or general lack thereof, okay, which type of political social order is shown in the diagram? This is feudalism, right? So hopefully you got feudalism for that. All right, so let's go through what feudalism is, all right? And of course, when we see this word feudalism, right? When we see this word feudalism, right, with Japan, this is, don't really see feudalism a lot that much anymore. You'll often more see it as serfdom. You kind of see it as serfdom, more often than not when you're looking at this. But let's just kind of go over some of the features of serfdom and feudalism, and let's do so by applying our skill of comparison. All right, so here we go. Right, so medieval Europe, right, also known to have serfdom in place, have a feudal structure in place. Right, so what do they have in common? How are they different? Right, so what are these? Hopefully, you can identify these correctly, and you did so as religion. So this is Christianity. Right, what is this one? Right, so this is kind of the Churko wheel, the wheel of life here. This is Buddhism. Right, which religion is symbolized by this? This is Shinto. Right, so this is a torii. You'll see tories throughout Japan, anywhere where the kami live. Right, so you'll see tories near the ocean, or on the beach, or out in the bay. You'll see it near a river. You'll see it in the forest. You'll see it in gardens, wherever the kami live. Right, you'll see tories. Right, all right. Next, right. So another difference. You could say that this is a similarity because they both have a group who are, tasked with maintaining order within society and permitted to kind of commit violence on behalf of the state, right? So these are your knights, these are your samurai, right? So hopefully you're able to identify that. Chivalry, right? The code of chivalry. You know what chivalry means? Probably not, because they say chivalry is dead, right? But Bushido was in your homework, so you should know what that is, right? So Bushido, way of the warrior. Right? All right, so what are these? All right, so this is the religious leader for Western Europe anyway. Right, so this is the Pope, the head of the Roman Catholic Church. Right, and this is our symbol for the emperor in Japan. Who, when our course begins by the year 1200, the emperor is really a religious leader, right? The religious head, right? So, because the shogun has power. So this is a lord, right? This is a lord. So the person who controls a manorial estate, right? This is the landed aristocracy of Europe, and in Japan we have the daimyo. Okay, so the daimyo. All right, and both Japan and Europe, right? These forms of feudalism have these kinds of oaths. You could say that this is kind of similar in a way to Confucianism, in that there are these relationships that exist, hierarchical relationships that exist, and that there's responsibility going both ways. Like, for example, the Lord has a responsibility, just like the daimyo does, to protect the serfs, right? To protect the peasants is another word you'll often see used for serfs, right? They have an obligation to protect them, and there's a flip side to that. The serfs or the peasants have an obligation to produce labor for the lords or for the daimyo in the case of Japan. Right? So there are these relationships that exist. It's kind of similar to Confucianism within China, but it's also much more formalized. Right? It's a very formalized, a literal contract in many, at least in the case of Europe. Right? This is another way of looking at it. Right? The kind of the hierarchy of Japanese feudalism. Right? And of course, missing from this is the shogun. Right? So I did put the shogun on here, and I guess in my first block today, some of my students started coming up with some ideas of who the shogun is for Glenn County. So we threw this together as a kind of way to help you understand. We took the Japanese feudal structure and then we applied it to the Glenn County schools, right? So in the Glenn County schools, who is the symbolic emperor? The symbolic emperor is our superintendent, I guess, right? So, so this is Dr. Spence. So if Dr. Spence is our emperor, right, who is the daimyo? Who are the leaders of the different, manorial estates of the school district, right? So under here, your daimyo would be, our principal. And for many of our students, or many of my students, a former principal of theirs. There you go. I'll throw that up there. And I believe she's still a daimyo, just at a different, fiefdom. Okay, to use a more European word there. All right. So who are the samurai? All right. So if you are using a cell phone, without permission in class, your daimyo is not going to deal with that, right? So who are the enforcers for the daimyo? Right, so these are some samurai you might recognize from past experience. You may have had her. She did retire last fall. So, but for those of you from Glen Middle, here's a samurai for you, right? That you might be able to remember. All right. So next, who are the artisans? Right? Who are the artisans? These are our Gika students. Our students who are doing apprenticeships to develop skills. Right. So at their age, currently these are the most skilled and, the skilled of the student population. All right, so who are the merchants? I always like to kind of put our student body is our merchant class, because some are really powerful and some are, maybe not as powerful as others, right? But they have a lot of freedom, right? A lot of freedom to come and go. Kind of as they please, and a lot of flexibility is given to these merchants. All right, and who are the peasant class? Right, obviously your teachers. Right, the last to know, the least input in what goes on. We basically have our obligations, on our fields here in our room, and we toil. Okay. All right. So then that begs the question: who is the shogun? Right? Who is the shogun? I used to always say, Mr. Poulos was our shogun, our former assistant superintendent, and I have all kinds of good reasons why he is a good example of a shogun, not the symbolic leader, but the kind of the political military boss of everything. The person who will. The person that you may not want to see show up, if you are a rival, if you are a rebel daimyo or a peasant revolting, you're not going to want to see him. So who's the current shogun? That's a little more difficult. My students came up with the assertion that she is our current daimyo, and I'm like, well, why is that? And the evidence that was brought up by students to support the assertion that she is our daimyo is she controls the schedules for, she and people like her, right? So people in that part of our school, they control the schedules for all the students and all the teachers in our school. And that's an immense amount of power. Then someone else chimed in. They wield so much power that they manipulated the schedule of both of our high schools in order to show a single PowerPoint once a week. That's a lot of power, right? That is wielding a lot of power and influence. So yeah, maybe I suggested maybe these people are the shogun. You know, they can change things whenever they want, and they can institute pretty dramatic changes in our lives. You know, so they're not. You know, I think a case could be made that this group of people, you know, was more of an emperor pre-2020, right? They were kind of off, and people didn't really know who they were, and in all this. But you know, they are definitely making some pretty dramatic decisions these days that are impacting everyone's lives, right? As a shogun would do, right? So maybe that helps. Maybe it doesn't help, right? Okay, so in class, at this point, you know, we kind of change gears and just kind of get into some general diffusion. And here's a nice little visual image to show you things that were being diffused out of China, you know, towards Korea, towards Japan. All right, you know, Buddhism, architectural styles, you know, writing is adopted, right? Writing styles is adopted. Confucianism, I mean, really strong in Korea during our time period. It'll become more influential in Japan during the Tokugawa shogunate after 1600. But during our time frame, you know, it'll have its moment before 1200, right? So by 1200, you're seeing feudal Japan kind of wane. All right, but there are a bunch of different examples, right? So law codes, writing, number systems, Buddhism, Confucianism, architecture, like pagodas, capital city. And I'd like to show a visual of this. So if you want to look at this for a minute, you're welcome to pause. I'm going to move on, right? So this is, you know, an image of Kyoto, right? So this capital city of Kyoto is actually designed, the layout of it in the palace is designed to be a carbon copy of Chang'an, right? So, you know, kind of the historic capital city established during the Qin era, right? So, yeah, so you see a lot of examples of diffusion. You know, here's another example. Here's another example of diffusion in Korea. All right, so one of the things that we kind of just run through in class today, you know, is this idea of selective borrowing. Okay, and which places can do more selective borrowing, and which places do less selective borrowing. You know, so if you were to do a list of most selective, right? So most, I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. If you were to do a hierarchy of most to least, okay, when it comes to selective borrowing, Japan is the most selective in its borrowing, all right? And then kind of running through your homework, right? What is today Vietnam was kind of some middle ground here, and Korea had the least amount of freedom to selectively borrow when it comes from cultural, political influences out of China, right? So why is this, right? So in class, we do take a moment and just kind of watch a video. It's called The History of Japan. I think Bill Wirtz is who created it. I'll try to put a link on Google Classroom so that you can watch that if you want. All right. It's about we actually only watched like the first probably like 4 minutes of it or so. Basically, we watch it until Japan begins our time frame as a shogunate, right? So 1200, Japan is a pretty strong centralized shogunate with different daimyos, right, in power, and then it breaks up in fragments and becomes highly decentralized in the 1400s. And that's kind of where we stop it, right? So and I guess it is kind of an oxymoron to call a feudal society centralized, right? So let's just maybe I should rephrase that. Japan was decentralized because feudalism is inherently decentralized into these different daimyos, right? But there is unifying factors, right, that existed. Initially the emperor and then the shogunate. shogunate was a unifying factor. Then you're going to see a deterioration of that. All right, so we see this kind of selectively borrowing. Right, so what do we mean by that? Right, so what comes from China to Japan? Right, what kind of things come from China to Japan? You know, it's things like the alphabet. Right, the alphabet. That's a alpha B-E-T, right? The alphabet, right, would be a good example. Calendar. I should try to write a little bit more legibly, right? So political structure, right? So we do kind of, and let me just kind of add legal system, right? So what we're really talking about here is the Tang Code. This is the kind of legal code established during the Tang Dynasty in China, right? And in Japan, this gets adapted. Okay? It's clearly an example of kind of cultural borrowing. All right, what else? What can we put here? Architecture. Architecture, so like pagoda. Pagoda style architecture would be another good example. Buddhism. Right, so Buddhism. So I guess originally it's coming out of Korea, but it's diffused into Korea via China. And then, of course, Zen Buddhism. Right? Zen Buddhism. Would be another kind of good example. We just talked about Kyoto. Right, so capital city. Right, so capital city where the emperor will live. Right, so there's some some examples of borrowing, of cultural diffusion from China into Japan. Right, so what don't they borrow, or what do they eventually kind of reject? And I don't mean to put numbers on these. Maybe I should just put like bullet points because there's no kind of order per se. Shinto, right? Shintoism. This is not come from China, right? This is Japanese, right? We also see kind of let's just say, I don't want to say they reject Confucianism because they do adopt Confucianism, kind of before our course begins in 1200. You do see a lot of Confucian influence, but you're going to see kind of a waning of that influence. So let's just say, reduced Confucian influence. All right, and of course, everything you get because of that reduced Confucian influence, things like less social mobility, right? Less meritocracy. That'd be kind of a couple good examples. Maybe you could even say the Shogun. Okay, the Shogun, right? This is not the emperor is an example of borrowing from China, but the Shogun is not, right? So that is, and I guess what makes the Shogun possible are the samurai, right? These samurai is uniquely, right? Let me see if I can clear that up a little bit. There you go. Is a uniquely Japanese entity, right? So when we talk about selectively borrowing, Japan has a lot of, and I'm just really kind of hitting a couple here. There's plenty more you could go, like literature, right? Initially adopted, right, and then become distinctly Japanese, right? But anyway, right. So what we did in class, right? Kind of what we did in class was, if we were to create a list, say, I'm just going to do this small, right? But what we did in class is we broke down Japan, Vietnam, and then Korea. Okay? and similarities and differences. All right, with China. All right, with China. Okay, so in class, we just, initially kind of looking at this, which ones, kind of make that box, I'm going to just have to zoom this out. Right, so in class, looking at this box, a very simple question is, which country is going to have the most amount of similarities? Right, which box is going to be the fullest for similarities? And the answer is going to be Korea, right? Which answer is going to be the most differences? Japan, right? And this, of course, has everything to do with geography and proximity of the peripheral state to the regional hegemon, right? So Japan is protected because of the isolation of the ocean, right? So it's a lot of effort. You're not going to march an army to Japan. Korea is the least protected from proximity to this regional hegemon. Vietnam, you have rainforests, thus making it difficult, for an invasion, but not impossible. It did happen. There was Chinese occupation for about 1,000 years. So before our course begins, right, so there's plenty of examples of that. It can be successful, but there's also a very real series of examples of successful resistance to the Chinese by Vietnam, right? Transistors is probably the most famous, all right? So, but yes, right? So now you kind of know what's going to be, kind of know what you're expecting, right? Kind of as you go into this activity. So in class, we just had students come up to the board using their homework from last night and fill this in, right? Fill this in. And we just kind of went over that and discussed those. So it's really just kind of application of your homework. If you have a hard time, or you think you have a hard time doing that, you can just kind of scroll up from where you're watching this video, and click on the kind of Chinese hegemony tab, the drop down. So this will tell you some major characteristics culturally in China, and then go through the cultural borrowing, right, from Korea, from Vietnam, in Japan. All right. So this is largely your homework from last night, kind of broken down into note form. All right. So so if you can't fill this box out from your notes, then I would suggest you look up and use the webpage to come up with some of these answers for you to help you out. So that's what we did in class, right? So we kind of filled that out in that big chart out. So that is all, right? You do not need to submit that chart today. It's just something that we did as a class activity. So, all right. And I believe that is about all. So let's kind of wrap this up, because we did that basically until the end of class. All right. So religion, economic, government structure East Asia were influenced by the region's hegemonic power, China. So make sure you're able to provide specific examples. Make sure you can fill out that chart. If you cannot, then you need to ask. And also be able to differentiate the levels of selective borrowing when you're comparing states such as Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Right, and of course, that tribute system influences both China and the peripheral states. There is influence going the other way. Of course, the most famous example from Vietnam would be champa rice. From Korea, probably movable type, right? In Buddhist texts that are being mass produced there. All right. So, and that's it. Right. That is all for today. Sapriyati.